Hey guys, I am Game Advisor, and today we'll be going over 10 of the most difficult survival games that we have ever played. And do keep in mind that this list is in no particular order, so let's jump in with number 1. First up is going to be Rust. Rust is arguably one of the most challenging survival games to get into, as it does have a pretty steep learning curve. And while its PvE survival mechanics aren't exactly the biggest challenge in the world, the PvP elements of the game is what makes it extremely hard and extremely punishing. You see, Rust, like most survival games, will cause you to lose all the things you're carrying upon death. However, Rust is a PvP game, which means you're going to be running into other players very often. And every time you fight them, that means that you're going to be risking everything you're carrying. And yes, you can get absolutely destroyed by a good player with a bow, even if you're wearing the best equipment in the game and have something like, say, an AK and plate armor. It also has many other challenging mechanics, such as learning to fly the gyrocopter, which tends to be a challenge for many players, learning to build a powerful and well-defended base with an optimal setup so that you aren't getting raided very easily. You also just have the fact that you can get offlined by other players, which is always not fun to have happen. And that doesn't even begin to mention things like monuments, the water content, electrical setups, vehicles, and so much more. Again, there is a ton of stuff to learn in Rust, so it has a steep learning curve, and then it's also extremely punishing while learning it, which is why it's on this list. Following that is Ark, and for those of you who don't know, Ark is a PvPvE survival game where you have to tame things like dinosaurs in order to survive and just hold your own. I mean, you've got the whole PvP side of the game, which is extremely punishing because the game can take hours and hours and hours and hours just to get anywhere in it, and just to learn how to do things, learn all the mechanics, learn how to do tame for a specific dinosaur. You know, I mean, for an example, it can take you 18 hours to get one single tame, and if that dies, it's gone. You don't get it back. There's no recovering those 18 hours of time. And this doesn't even begin to mention the PvE elements of the game that are extremely challenging, such as fighting bosses, which are almost impossible to solo in some cases. Either way, Ark is one of the most challenging games out to date, and while it can be made simpler and less grindy by just changing the modification settings and adding actual full-on mods to the game, it's still in its base game version is incredibly difficult, incredibly time-consuming, and incredibly challenging to learn the mechanics for. Following that is Tarkov, which is a PvP game based in a realistic world with realistic bullet physics and mechanics. This means there's realistic armor values with realistic bullet stopping powers. So if you go into a game with high tier armor and you get shot directly in that armor with a low caliber weapon, there's a good chance you won't even feel it, which does mean that gear is incredibly important in the game, and it makes it incredibly important to decide who will win fights. Tarkov thrives on that sense of realism, which is what makes it such a difficult game, because most gamers just don't know enough about real-world militaristic weaponry and militaristic armor, or even civilian weaponry and armor, in order to understand half of what the game's telling you. The learning curve alone about how the game functions and where everything is and where the best loot is and how to level up things and how to do quests, which by the way don't really tell you where to go and what to do for them, other than the very occasional vague quest that's like, hey, I lost a note in this forest somewhere near a crashed plane, and go find it. And may I just say, good luck finding that unless you're going to go look up a tutorial, because that's basically impossible. Either way, Tarkov is a very challenging game and is definitely deserving of a spot on this list. Number 4 is Dark and Darker, which is kind of like a medieval sequel to Tarkov without the super hyper realism elements. It's a fantasy-based full loot game that has you going into game modes just like you do in Tarkov, where you have to be the last one standing and try to get out, with a circle closing in forcing you to leave within a certain amount of time. The game has very punishing PvE mechanics and extremely difficult bosses that drop extremely high-end loot, so you'll want to go do those. However, even if you are able to take them out, you'll have to survive an onslaught of other mobs as well as other players every single time you play in order to get any of that loot. Keep in mind, this is a full loot game, so if you die, you'll be losing everything you have, and you will have no way of getting it back, since this isn't like an open world game where you can go back and get your bag. Dark and Darker still is currently in beta at time of recording this video, but it is still very challenging every time we've played it, so it is something that definitely needs to be on this list. Alrighty, we're halfway there with number 5, which is a well-known game called DayZ. DayZ is arguably the first big survival game that ever came out. If you don't know, it is a zombie apocalypse survival game based in the Arma 2 engine, which does have a lot of realistic bullet physics and mechanics built into it. DayZ is also a full loot game like pretty much every game on this list, which means if you die, you'll be incredibly punished for it. The game has 1,000,001 little nuances you'll have to learn before you even start thinking about PvP though, as personally, I was dying to things like colds, eating raw food, and all the other different mechanics that were built into the actual survival elements when I was playing the game for the first time, and it took me maybe 50 to 60 hours to get to the point where I could just survive consistently without dying from things like hunger, thirst, food poisoning, the weather, or just about anything else in the game. And then that's not even to mention the fact that PvE mobs can be extremely dangerous in large chunks, and then you get to start trying to figure out how to deal with all the players. Number 6 is Dwarf Fortress, and we are talking about both the old and new versions of it. Regardless of which you play, just know that Dwarf Fortress is probably the most complex colony sim game that currently exists, in which every single minute detail matters. Yes, there are things that are technically more detailed, but in this game, all those details matter. If you're playing the original Dwarf Fortress, it basically just looks like a bunch of squares and circles and colored icons on a screen moving around, and it's hard to even know what you're looking at. And with the new one, which does make it a little bit better to see what's happening on screen, the game still has insane amounts of complexity that you have to pay attention to. So regardless of if you're a skilled player that's been playing it for 100 hours and knows most of what most of the mechanic does, or you're a new player, this game is always going to have more for you to learn and more for you to try to survive, as it is an incredibly in-depth game and is probably the most in-depth survival game that exists today. Number 7 is Project Zomboid. Project Zomboid is sort of similar to games like DayZ in the sense that you'll be spawned into a world and have to go loot towns and try to survive. The major differences here though is it is a one-life game. This means if you die at any point in time, you will no longer be able to play that character and lose any and all progress they have. While the game does have a PvP scene, that's not even the challenging part, as just dealing with all of the different challenges that PvE brings is incredibly difficult enough. As the game goes on, things will get more challenging, the weather will change, water will shut off, power will shut off, and much more. The whole idea is that this game is built to be a survival game that simulates what would happen if a real-world zombie apocalypse occurred. Therefore, it's very challenging to actually learn and figure out what the best things are to do. Without tutorials and online guides, you will eventually get there, but even with them, you can fully expect to die probably at least 100 times before you're able to survive for more than a month in the game consistently. Up next is the Don't Starve franchise, which looks extremely simple on the surface, as it's basically just a 2D game where you're playing around in the world and you're playing as this kind of paper-looking character, and you have to kind of survive some things like, some pigs, maybe, you have to just keep yourself fed, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, the game is incredibly challenging to learn. You have things like bosses which spawn every so often, you have all sorts of different mechanics depending on which version of Don't Starve you're playing, and most of all, you have to be able to handle the non-stop amount of food your character seems to need. Just learning to feed yourself is a challenge on its own. It took me probably 20 hours of gameplay before I was fully experienced enough just to keep myself fed. I mean, what kind of survival game actually has the feeding yourself part being one of the most challenging parts of the game? Yes, you can master it. Yes, you will eventually get good enough at the game that feeding yourself isn't too much of a challenge, but at no point in time will you ever get into this game and say, hey, it is easy to feed myself. I don't ever have to even think about it, because the reality is you're going to have to constantly be hunting for food, planting crops, or doing something at all times to keep yourself fed, or you'll end up in a situation where you have no food, and in this game, it is a one-death game. That means if you die, you'll be losing your character and all of the progress and starting from day one all over again. Alrighty, we are almost there with number 9, and that is Conan Exiles, which is a PvPvE survival game based in the Conan universe. You've got things like magic in the game, there's fighting, and while at the beginning you'll be just trying to survive from things like bandits and creatures in the world, the more you get into the game, the more you'll have to grind and fight to survive. You can do things like quote-unquote hire people, which I use very loosely in the game, in order to make them help you with fighting off different things and farm and craft things at your base. Regardless, Conan Exiles is a challenging enough game just on the PvE front, but when you start adding PvP into the mix, which is where the real game starts, you are going to have a challenge on your hands. I mean, for Pete's sakes, people can summon entire gods into the world and then smash your entire base, and there's almost nothing you can do about it. Now, our last game on this list is one that is well known for being a very, very grindy and very challenging and cooperation-oriented survival game. And while it may not be played that much anymore, it is still deserving of a spot on this list, and that is Life is Feudal. Life is Feudal is one of the most grind-worthy games on this list, and it is extremely punishing when you die, as you'll be losing everything you're carrying. Everything has a skill associated with it, whether that be mining, woodcutting, crafting, weapon making, or just about anything else in the game. You're going to have to level a skill to do it. And to level those skills takes a lot of time. And I don't mean some time, I mean a lot of time. Just trying to grow a crop in the game can take an insane amount of your time in real life just to dedicate to get that thing grown. The game was so much fun, but it was so challenging and so punishing and required you to play in a large clan, group, guild, whatever you want to call it, that it turned away so many players and ended up killing a large portion of its population. So nonetheless, Life is Feudal is a great game, but just keep in mind there's a reason why it's not as popular as some of the other games on this list, and that is because it is so punishing that most players just don't want to deal with it. And well, that's going to go ahead and wrap up this list. I do want to give a quick shout out to our Platinum and Above channel members, which currently include Caustic FPV, Jonathan S, Gerald89, Jim Phillips, and AZ Blackbird. If you guys want to be a channel member yourself and help support us, do feel free to hit that join button down below. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I'm Game Advisor, and I'll see you next time.